I'm Vicky Houlden. I'm in the Centre for Spatial Analysis and Policy at the University of Leeds. And my research primarily focuses on the socio-spatial context, which influences both the structure of the urban environment and subsequent health outcomes. My main focus is the relationship between green space and mental well-being, and how we incorporate green spaces into urban environments to create a healthy and positive place for people to live and work. And this research really is something that started during my PhD a few years ago and has really sort of evolved and built since then. And a lot of what I'm looking at really is the socio-spatial inequalities, why certain places have better provision, how we measure accessibility and how that varies from place to place. So if you were in Sarah Linley's really interesting keynote earlier, there is going to be a little bit of overlap with looking at the different accessibility metrics there. I'm going to start by just talking a little bit more about why green space and wellbeing are two things that you really should care about, and a little bit of background, the kind of methods and data, and then talk about where we want to go next with this. So there's kind of an ongoing assumption that being in nature is good for us. And there is evidence to suggest this, but a lot of this is fairly anecdotal and often gets picked up with the media. It's kind of something I think a lot of people can relate to. We like going out for walks in natural places. And I think particularly over the last year, we've really felt it when we've been confined to our local areas and not being able to visit the places we really enjoy visiting a lot. So there's been a real growth of this understanding over the last year, and a lot of the media has been picking up on this as well. And we've really started to value our local green spaces. But this has had particularly the stay-at-home orders have had a quite disproportionate impact on Black and minority ethnic and more deprived communities. They're less likely to have access to a private garden and also likely to have poorer green space provision, which can also go on to impact their health when they're already potentially at a higher risk of the virus. There's a lot of studies that look at various aspects of nature and different mechanisms, but what we've actually found from doing systematic literature reviews is that there's a huge variation in definitions of both green space and wellbeing, a lot of small sample sizes and cross-sectional studies, and these tend to be extrapolated towards a more one-size-fits-all approach. There's not very much coming at this from more of a spatial and planning perspective, which is what I'm trying to address. I'm trying to build on the limitations of these studies to use larger data sets, spatial analysis, and some longitudinal data and methods to start looking at more temporality and hopefully infer causality in the relationship between green space and wellbeing. So one reason we're really starting to take more notice of our health is that, admittedly, this graph is a couple of years out of date now, but if we look at how the economy has grown over the last few years pretty steadily, we're starting to notice an increasing gap between measures of GDP and life satisfaction. So it's kind of the old adage, money doesn't make you happy. And we know this to be true. And at a certain level, a little bit more money is going to give you more opportunities, but overall, it's not going to increase your life satisfaction significantly. And what we see actually is that rather than more economically prosperous communities having better health, we actually see that countries and localities with greater economic inequalities tend to also have greater health inequalities. And we're also seeing larger and larger health inequalities in wellbeing data. And this is kind of this growing wellbeing inequality that needs to be addressed. And neighbourhood factors contribute to this quite a lot. So particularly the physical, social, environmental deprivation account for a 7-year difference in life expectancy across England, and also disproportionate access to green space. This is particularly more pronounced in urban areas. You'd expect this with green space, but also we find health, particularly mental health, tends to be poorer in urban areas. And this is a growing problem as we now have over 80% of England's population living in urban areas. And it's thought that this is partly because cities are designed for like accessibility, transport, economics, but generally they evolve and change, and they've kind of often grown fairly organically over time. We don't necessarily know how to design them to benefit health and well-being. And one way we can do this is by hopefully by increasing our contact with nature, which we need to do in an informed way. Before we go on, I'm just going to take a quick step back and discuss a little bit more about what well-being is, so you understand the context of what I'm working. So well-being changes over the time. So if you look at the graph on the left, we can see that we've got our well-being oscillates within a normal range around our baseline. It's thought that our baseline is about 50% a set point, which is predetermined by our genetics, and around 10% due to our circumstances, such as our education, our ethnicity, our life experience, which are things we don't immediately have control over. So it tends to oscillate within a normal range, and this is really normal, but everyone will have a slightly different baseline. It can increase beyond our normal range after, for example, a really positive life experience, like, I don't know, a promotion or getting married, but it tends to acclimatize. And this is good when we think about things that can cause our health and well-being to dip below the normal level. For example, a global pandemic, we do find we tend to reacclimatize over time. But what we're really interested in is this 40% of well-being, which is to do with our choices, which can be to do with our lifestyles, the way we live, and the way we interact with the environment. So by improving the urban environment, we've hopefully got this opportunity to improve people's mental well-being, which has ramifications for social prosperity and longevity. And looking at green space, there's a lot of different disparate definitions, data, and methods looking at green space planning, and guidance is really vague. And this is partly because green space planning is disaggregated among loads of different sectors. For example, like if we're looking at infrastructure or transport or housing, there's not one place we can go to and see this is how much green space we should have, this is how it should be designed, this is where it should be relative to people. The exception to this is the Natural England Accessible Natural Green Space Guidance, with two caveats. Firstly, this is guidance, and it's not written into policy. There's nowhere where there's a specific policy requirement for a certain amount of green space. And secondly, it was archived in 2012, and there's been no updated green space guidance since then. So what we need to do is we need robust evidence that showed us where green space should be, how it should be designed, where it should be geographically and relative to residents, so we can create healthy green living environments, because green space is only in cities if we put it there. So we need to understand how to do this to maximize benefit to the widest population. And this isn't just a UK issue, this is a global issue. So these are the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So 3 of these: good health and wellbeing, reduced inequalities, and sustainable cities and communities, which has a specific clause on improving access to green space. But again, it doesn't really tell us how to do this. So this is where my research comes in. These are the 3 main research questions I'm working towards at the moment. Firstly, looking at access to green space. So starting off with cross-sectional studies, but moving towards more temporal analysis to try and infer causality, look at migration. How does people well-being respond to moving to greener or less green environments? Secondly, forms of green space, so looking at facilities and types and how this varies between people and places. Bring us on to research question 3, which is really looking at those socio-spatial inequalities and whether it differs among people and places. So firstly, the data reviews is we firstly got the Ordnance Survey Green Space Master Map, which has most of the green spaces in the country, and these have a type label and the area as well as the locations as the shapefile. So it has a number of different types, but I've aggregated them for the purposes of these research because I wanted to look at the main types and the most usable types, which also give us an implication of how people might interact with the space. So natural spaces enable people to connect with nature, which can be beneficial to mental health. Parks, which can be used for recreation and socializing, and sports, which are primarily used for physical activity. I looked at green space as a whole, but also stratified by type later on. For the individual data, I've used the UK Household Longitudinal Study and the Annual Population Survey, which are 2 really large-scale data sets which have a range of really good socioeconomic, demographic, living experience, health variables. And what's really good about this is that we can access this at a postcode level. So it has a whole range of different variables, and 2 of them that I think are really important are the lived experience and lifestyle ones. So as well as having income, for example, it also asks people about their subjective financial situation, as well as asking them, as well as things like looking at deprivation in the neighbourhood, we can ask people how they feel about their neighbourhood. So it gives a really interesting insight into how people experience their environment. In terms of well-being, it's got 4 different indicators. I'm mostly concerned with the top 2. So mental well-being, which is a measure of positive mental health. So rather than necessarily preventing illness as a sort of medical tool, it's more about promoting well-being for everyone. And then life satisfaction, which is a relatively straightforward, how satisfied are you with your life? Well-being is measured on a scale of 0 to 35, life satisfaction 1 to 7, and it's always higher number is better. We also got in the Ordnance survey open roads, so we can connect individual postcodes to their green spaces, as well as the LSOA shapefiles and the English indices of multiple deprivation. And because of the deprivation availability, this analysis is restricted to England, although some of these were restricted to London while we trialled the methods. So looking at green space accessibility, firstly, we locate the individuals, and then we can calculate their local area in a number of different ways and kind of compare these to look at how different accessibility or local area metrics relate to well-being. And so we can look at where green space potentially should be to maximize the associations with well-being. First of these is the LSOA. That's the lower layer super output area. If you're not familiar with that, it's a data collection area. Doesn't necessarily represent lived neighborhoods. It's more designed as a data collection tool, though it's designed to be fairly homogeneous in terms of population, average population around 1,500, but because it's population based, they do vary considerably in size and kind of geographic size according to population density. We can also use radius, which is just creating like a linear buffer around a place, which is, and we can use multiple buffers to look at different distances. This gives us an amount, like an indication of the amount of green space surrounding someone's home. So if we're looking at things like proximity, whether they might have greener views from a home, things like green spaces protecting against pollution and the heat island effect, that would give us an indication of that from the radius. And it's also a lot quicker and less computationally intensive than travel distance, which is in graph C, which is where we calculate a network around the individual and look at how much green space they have access to within a certain distance. We can also, if you look at graph B, then we can also stratify by the different types, and we can calculate how many of these different types individuals have access to in their local area. And the way we analyze this was firstly using geographically weighted regression. So if that's not something that you're familiar with, I'm going to give you just a really quick crash course in that so you understand what I'm talking about. So equation 1 is your standard linear regression, y equals beta, so your intercept plus beta 1, your coefficient, and then x, which is your the individual observation, and then beta, that would represent all of the different variables we're building in. Primarily that's our green space measure, but then we also control for a range of socioeconomic, environmental, demographic factors in our equation. But what geographically weighted regression does, it's essentially a linear regression model that can vary across space, and U is each of the different spaces. So we get a different coefficient, and this allows us to look at how the strength of the association varies across space, which accounts for kind of the strength of the association varying, but also underlying spatial component of the data. And the way we do this is we have all our data. So these are all our data points. And we'd start by calculating the geographically weighted regression for each person. So say we had 10,000 people on a data set, we'll end up with 10,000 regression models, which individually wouldn't tell us that much. It would just enable us to look at how the associations vary across space, where might green space be more important than others. And then we can aggregate this to calculate a global regression, which is really similar to your linear regression. So we start by locating our individual here, and we calculate a buffer around them. And there's different ways you can do that. We use a optimization function just to minimize the errors in the data set. So for the first step, just these neighbors would be included in this regression model, and we weight them according to how close they are to the individual using a Gaussian weighting function. So for each neighbor, for example, this one, we calculate how far they are away from that individual, and we use that to calculate the weight. And then the weights are used to calculate the coefficients. So essentially, this enables us to look at spatial variation where closer individuals are more strongly weighted within the model. And then this is all done within the bandwidth that we've optimized. We can also extend this to build in time. So this is essentially doing this, but adding another dimension where we repeat it at various time points and can look at the spatiotemporal variation. So what do we find? Well, we started off by looking at across England at LSOA level green space and how this was related to mental well-being. So that's meant positive mental health. Initially, we found quite a promising, strong association. So an increase in green space was associated quite strongly with increased mental well-being. But when we've adjusted for a range of socioeconomic environmental factors, we found this was attenuated to the null. There's no longer a statistically significant association there. And this kind of backs up what we were saying before about how LSOAs, they can be really good for some things. They're great for collecting data, and they've shown associations with various aspects of health when looking at green space, but they don't seem to be capturing people's lived environment and how they're exposed to green space. So we moved on to looking at linear buffers, Euclidean buffers, as these were the kind of slightly more computationally intensive, but not as much as network analysis, which we're working towards. Because this was more intensive, this was restricted to London using an annual population survey. So we still had 20,000 individuals. And this is something we're planning on expanding out across England, which I'm currently working on at the moment. I was hoping to have a bit more to show you on this by now, but COVID got in the way, as it does. So we're still working on that. And hopefully by next year, we'll have a lot more to show for that. So looking at Euclidean distance, what we found really interestingly is this kind of decrease across distance. So we calculated buffers at 300, 500 and 1,000 meters. And we found the strongest association when looking at green space within 300 meters of people. And then this kind of seems to depreciate over distance, suggesting that green space closer to home is more important, or more strongly associated at least, with well-being than that further away. And then when we look back at that geographically weighted association, this is how that association varies across space. And what we find is with the darker green being the stronger association, shows that there is a lot of variation. And a lot of these stronger associations are observed towards the outskirts of London. So this got us thinking, what's the difference there? Could it be the type of green space? Well, if you've been to London, you'll know that towards the centre, there's a lot more of the kind of organised formal Victorian parks, whereas further out it's more likely to be larger, slightly more natural spaces, and also less population density and more space to move around. So potentially there's more green space per person as well. So building on this, we decided to look at network distance, and we found similar associations to the Euclidean buffers. But what was really interesting was when we looked at the different types. So I have only included the results for natural green space here, because we looked at natural green space, parks, sports facilities, and other. And really interestingly, we only found associations for natural green spaces, but again, the strongest association within 300 meters, really suggesting that this 300 meters seems to be important. And it's something that we want to look at in a lot more detail when we can start doing some more longitudinal analysis. So natural green space, again, being relatively strongly associated with two aspects of well-being, the strongest association for life satisfaction, and secondly, with happiness. We also started to look at how different socioeconomic and demographic factors associated with well-being, and this at the moment is non-spatial. It's something we're working on, building in the green space characteristics into this. So this is just looking at how the various socioeconomic and demographic factors vary in association with well-being in a fully adjusted linear regression model. And what I think is really interesting is that so as I was saying before, with Black and minority ethnic and more deprived communities less likely to have access to green space, they're also more likely to have poorer well-being. So that's a negative association in the red and a positive association in the blue. The strength of the colour indicates the strength of the association. But what I think is really interesting is if we look at income here, like towards the middle, we see a very slight negative association. So having more money isn't strongly associated with your well-being. But if you ask people about their subjective finances, so this is how are you coping financially, that gives you a much more strong insight into how people are coping, and it gives you more of an insight in how their lived experience and how they feel their finances might be related to their well-being. So we find a strong positive association between subjective finances. If you feel you're doing better financially, you also tend to have better mental well-being. Also on this, we're looking at IMD, so that's the index of multiple deprivation, a really weak association with mental well-being. But if we look at neighbourhoods, that's asking people how they feel about their neighbourhood, whether they feel proud of it, whether they feel at home there, whether they feel they get on with their neighbours and can rely on their neighbours. We find a positive association between neighbourhood satisfaction and mental well-being. So this gives us a really interesting insight into how people feel about their environment and their lives and how this relates to them at well-being. So the next stage is to build in the green space of this and start looking at some more temporal analysis. So we've got some temporal building in here, looking at the 3 different time points, and also looking at whether people have moved. So people have moved in the last 3 years tend to have better well-being, and we speculate that's because potentially it might be that they're moving due to new employment or improved life circumstances, moving for jobs and opportunities, things like that. Or it could be that people who moved are more likely to be moving up the housing ladder or are more financially in control, although that's something, obviously that's entirely speculation and something that requires a lot more examination in the next stage. So what have we found really is that it's proximity to green space, not the proportion, that gives you a much stronger indication of what's going on in someone's local area. And green space within 300 meters really does seem to be this, it's kind of like golden kind of point by which green space seems to be more important. And that's been shown for other health indicators as well. We did also look, just the caveat, at spaces below 300 meters, but actually the results there were non-significant and were giving us like really, really low coefficients and were non-significant, so they're not included in the graph there. And then again, this potential dose response effect, and that potentially natural spaces are more strongly associated with well-being than others. And we don't know exactly why that is. And that's also not to say that other types aren't really important. It's just that in the way we'd characterize it there, natural green spaces potentially enable you to connect with nature and kind of dig into this biophilic evolutionary desire to connect with natural spaces and kind of feel more at one with nature in the way you don't get necessarily from more ornamental parks or sports facilities. Variation across space is really key, and that's something that we're really going to be looking at in more detail later on. And like also that experiences and individual measures give you much more of an insight into people's lived experiences than more objective or arbitrary local area characterization. So what we're going to do next is to expand this across England and start doing some more temporal analysis, looking at people moving and how their well-being's changed over time compared to those who don't move, and also trying to build in, we'd like to build in some indicators of green space change, although you can't necessarily do that from a mapping perspective, but something to do with LiDAR or sensors might enable us to do that. And also looking at comparisons of form and some more participatory methods. We've started doing some things with deploying audio sensors to measure biodiversity, which I'd really like to do more of, working with citizens as well to understand what's important to who and why. Looking more at these socio-spatial inequalities, and finally aiming to benefit kind of policy and interventional studies, because at the moment there's not that kind of robust central policy which defines where green space should be and how it should be designed to maximise health benefits, which is something that I really want to address through my research. So that's everything from me. Thank you very much for sticking with me on this really sunny Friday afternoon. So if you've got any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Firstly, from Lex, did you think about using multi-scale GWR? I asked because this is supposed to be the default GWR, and it shows how different variables operate at different spatial scales. So multi-scale GWR?
We didn't yet. That's because most of the GWS stuff was done a couple of years ago during my PhD, when I was still kind of getting to the grips with the models. But that's something I'm definitely, thanks for the suggestion. I will definitely be looking at that kind of more like in the future. But yeah, at the moment we use the kind of one scale, kind of optimizing the buffer using like an inbuilt algorithm, which gives you minimizes the errors in the bandwidth. But that's something we'll definitely, thanks, look at in the future.
Another question from Fiona Marshall: is there any evidence that it is possible to have too much natural space in relation to well-being? So I think,
That's kind of dependent on context. So if we think about people who live in a really potentially quite isolated rural area, that could contribute to loneliness and things like that. But one thing to consider, particularly like in more urban areas, if you have too much natural space, it would be possibly due to like the quality of the spaces. So if you're kind of too far from your neighbors, or if places they're too big. So for example, a green space that you might cut through during the day, that's a wonderful natural space, if it's not well lit or well supervised, or it's too isolated at night, or potentially that could feel quite threatening. You wouldn't necessarily take a shortcut through there on your own at night. So I think that's something that's really important to consider. And I think that's, the point being that context is really important there.
Another question from Labib is, can you just clarify a bit more on the measures used only include public green space that are accessible? Do you think the other measures such as green space visibility around the home would provide some better explanation on well-being, considering the attention, restoration and stress recovery theory? Also, how many people do not have access to within 300 meters but can view the street trees, for example?
That's a really good point. So this, because I was using the green space master map, that's public green space only. And part of the reason was because you're already taking account of, so we have looked at people's household types as well. So obviously people who live in flats and things wouldn't necessarily have access to a private garden, but part of this is just that when you're looking at every single public green space in a certain area, you end up with enormous data sets. So computationally, as well as kind of looking at the research questions, it's kind of not feasible to conduct this kind of analysis using all green spaces. So kind of picking between public and private are kind of two things you might look at separately. Also completely agree about the street trees. That's why I want to start looking a little bit more at, for example, like LiDAR data and potentially tree canopy. And that's something we've got a funding bid, fingers crossed, in at the moment to look a little bit more at trees, because I think they can be, particularly for people, I want to say older people and people who spend more time at home, basically all of us who have been stuck in our homes for the last year, being able to see trees or nature from our homes can be like really beneficial and really restorative potentially. So I think that's something that's really important to consider as well. It's just, not within the scope of what we've done so far.
Okay, Sarah asks, I was wondering if you could consider some aspects of natural green space quality in the stages, e.g. land cover diversity. I guess you touched on that just then, but I mean, have you considered that in more detail?
So part of, I think the problem with it is that there's so much you could do, and it's really difficult to kind of like narrow it down into like what can we do at each stage with the data that's available. So far, having worked with the Ordnance Survey Master Map, that's not something that's included. Although you can get, if we wanted to look at things like Green Flag Award, you can start looking at the quality. But I think if you wanted to look at the kind of the land cover diversity in more detail, that would have to be at a smaller scale. Although there is some data on this for London. I believe the Greenspace Information for Greater London group, the GIGL, have some data on that. So that's definitely something I would, like to look at. It's just kind of working towards all of that.
Okay. Another technical question, I guess, is from Nick Ham, is how does the buffer interact with the bandwidth in GWR?
So far we've mostly considered them separately, but what we did was when we optimized the bandwidth before, we computed that for the buffer distances at each distance. So we did this for 300 meters, 500 meters and 1 kilometer, and it was coming back with the same optimized buffer of around 2 kilometers each time. So we're pretty confident that it's not an issue, but it's probably something, to be aware of, that you've kind of got those two different ways of characterizing space that could potentially interact. But it's not something that we found so far.
Just a quick question for myself, really. I mean, there was a paper that I just saw in Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health this week from the Mind Map project in Europe, which suggests that green space may be less important for older urban residents. I was wondering if you had a look at those types of demographic factors in your analysis. Is there any indication from what you've done that urban, the elderly are going to be less impacted, if you like, by green space?
Okay, so I think older people are more likely to be impacted by private green space, and there's or kind of views from home. Because there are studies that show particularly older people who can view greenery from their living room, particularly things like trees where they can see seasons changing quite easily, that can enable them to feel less lonely. And also studies that show people, for example, with various forms of dementia will still get the same restorative benefits from nature, even if they can't particularly specifically recall those specific interactions. And also some that show that kind of the association between well-being and green space is likely to vary across life course, and that tends to be a sort of U-shape, so higher, stronger associations in younger and older adults, and then like a dip in middle age. So I think that's something that would be really interesting to look at and see how that crops up in my data. And it's something, again, we're working towards looking at these different interactions with life courses and different kind of subsets of demographics.
Okay, time for one more, I think. There's an interesting development of the separated category in the graph from 2013 to 2016. Do you have any possible explanation for that?
Yeah, so that would be here is that people who are separated. So this is bottom left. So this is looking at relationships. So you've got single and not living with partner, partnered, which is if you're married or cohabiting or in a civil partnership, and then separated, which is people separated, divorced, widowed, devolved, civil partnership. And at the moment, yeah, I wondered whether it's potentially, so partly people tend to be happier in older age anyway. So I'm wondering whether there's an interaction with that, or potentially people exiting unhappy marriages, for example. But yeah, that's definitely something that requires, so this is relatively new findings, these interactions. So this is something definitely I'll be looking at in more detail. I think that's going to be a really interesting little aside there.
Okay. One more question. I think this kind of relates to, well, we did some early research in Cardiff, which was published a few years ago, which are looking at the nature of the network distance.
Yeah. And
the question is, we have from Duncan is, we have measured distance to green space from population weighted centroid using Google Map API. What differences does that the actual? I mean, in our research, we looked at, for example, the centroid of the green space or the actual gates to the openings of the green space. Does it make a difference, those kinds of sensitivity measures on the actual, the actual findings? Have you looked at that kind of level of detail?
So that's another thing that's kind of difficult to build in, is that different green space data sets have different attributes, and it's kind of trying to build everything you can into one model to take account of it. So yeah, access points is included in in the open green space data, but this was the green space master map access through license that we used. So trying to combine those, and because actually they are kind of slightly different in format, which means it's not always possible to join them, but looking at access through the access points is something that would be really useful. It's not something I've got round to yet. So essentially what we've done is looked at how much green space, if you could get to the boundary of it, it was essentially considered as part of the green space. But I definitely think there's room for all these different measures. I think we just keep trying everything, and then we will get to a point where it's basically just different computational methods might give us slightly different insights, and I think combined they'll just kind of be a lot more beneficial. But yeah, at the moment I'm working very much at the individual level, because I've got this really good data that's got postcode level, so you've got the individual accessibility.